SJ. Welcome to Muskogee Radio, your weekly source for tribal and community news, interesting guests and discussions, plus a local events calendar. Good morning. SJ, Stone Go, Gary Fife here, post-festival. We hope that you had a chance to attend and had a great time. Just some wonderful weather. The music acts were just outstanding. Lots of good times and some good fiber to do. So always have to stick that one in. So we took a couple days off to recover, and of course you saw that the nation was closed yesterday for everyone to recover. But we're back in the saddle here on the Wednesday, rather, having that Monday off, rather. But let's get to work. Recently, we noticed towards the end of April, there was an anniversary of an event that really helped put this state of Oklahoma together, and that was the 1889 land rush. We've got sharing our program today Professor Lindsay Robertson with the Oklahoma University, and Nelson Harjo will be here later in our second portion to talk about some of the election events coming up. We want to remind you, get out and vote. But first of all, let's chat with Professor Robertson. Sir, are you there?
I am indeed.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for making time in your schedule to join us. We really appreciate you being able to share your knowledge and experience with us.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, well, let's get to it then. Was it around April the 24th, 25th, something like that? That was the anniversary of the land rush?
Yeah, April 22nd.
Okay, yeah, we noticed that. And that brings up an event that really helped shape and fulfill the dreams of a lot of people who wanted land here and had an opportunity here in Oklahoma. But first of all, let's get a capsule idea of what the land rush was all about. How did that come about, and what happened there, sir?
Well, to understand the land run, you sort of have to step back in time a full generation to the Civil War, which really made the land run possible. The land run, as we know, is one of the largest giveaways of free land in world history. But to understand why it happened, you sort of had to understand whose the land was originally and how it came to be available, and that's really a Civil War story. The Civil War, of course, was precipitated by the secession of the southern states starting in December 1860 with South Carolina, and then most of the late winter and early spring of 1861. The five tribes in Oklahoma, including the Muskogee Nation and the Seminole Nation, and the Chickasaws, Cherokees, and Choctaws, had, of course, been effectively forcibly removed from the southeastern U.S. to what became unofficially called Indian Territory in the 1830s and 40s, and their lands covered all of what we know as Oklahoma today. Muskogee Nation, most of the middle portion, Seminole Nation, as your listeners will know, initially part of the Muskogee Nation, and in 1856 the Seminoles and the Muskogee government entered into a treaty in which the Seminoles simply took as their own land part of the original Muskogee lands and established their own territory. When the Civil War came, one of the first things that the Confederate government did was to name as their Indian Affairs Commissioner a sort of large, eccentric man from Arkansas named Albert Pike. And Pike came straight away out to the Indian Territory to see if he could negotiate treaties of alliance with the five tribes in principle, and then with some of the western tribes who were leasing lands out in the western part of the Indian Territory from the Chickasaw Nation. And he was successful for a number of reasons, and all five of the tribes signed treaties of alliance and sent troops to support the Confederate Army. There was more support for this in some tribes than in others. The Cherokees virtually had a civil war of their own during the American Civil War. But when the war was done, the official United States position was, you guys violated your treaty obligations to the U.S. when you sided with the Confederates and took up arms against us, and so one of the consequences will be that you're going to lose the western half of the lands of the Indian Territory. Seminole Nation was compelled to give up all of their lands. Muskogee Creek Nation was compelled to give up the western portion of their lands, and it was that territory that was originally Muskogee and Seminole that became the lands that were open to allotment in 1889. So, they were, as a sort of legal matter, and you can argue about the fairness of the post-Civil War treaties, but at least from a U.S. legal perspective, they were lands that were no longer under the control of tribes, although they had been originally under the control of the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation.
Yeah, you mentioned allotments there. I think that's a critical term there. Why don't you take a second there and kind of define what that was?
Sure. Well, allotment actually happens after the land run in Oklahoma. The allotment policy was a post-Civil War policy in which the federal government decided that the smart thing to do with the tribes was to break their lands up, ostensibly to eliminate collective ownership of lands and have each tribal citizen have his or her own individual farm, and the thinking was then they'll be more committed to becoming farmers because it's their land and they'll take pride in it and this sort of thing. But of course, under the surface, because virtually everywhere the amount of land given out was a fixed number of acres, you multiply the acres, it might be 80 acres of farmland, for instance, times the total number of tribal citizens, and there's going to be a lot of land left over. And that's what the U.S. then took. They either bought it from the tribes or they sold it off for the tribes. And allotment was devastating for tribes in Oklahoma. The process started the same year as the land run. The president appointed a commission we call the Jerome Commission after its chair, and his job was to come out and sort of cut deals with individual tribes to figure out how their lands would be allotted. If they sold their surplus lands, how much they'd get for them. All five of the tribes in eastern Oklahoma signed allotment agreements. The Creeks in 1897, Seminoles also in 1897, and then the distribution of lands began in earnest. And allotment is really the reason that the jurisdictional map in Oklahoma is so confusing, because there's still a lot of allotments, individual allotments that are held as what we call trust lands. Those are all Indian country under federal law, so those are the areas in Oklahoma in which tribes exercise their full jurisdiction. But they can be next to a piece of land that isn't. Again, this is because of the confusion that allotment created.
Now, one question that's perhaps a little further off the beaten track here. Now, when we're talking about the dealings between the United States and the tribal governments, we're not talking about a racial relationship there. We're talking more political, right?
Yeah, and that's a hugely important point that a lot of people who don't sort of live in this world don't understand. In most of the world, when you say, that somebody is an Indian, which is the legal term of art in the U.S., then people, what that means, as for indigenous peoples elsewhere, is it's either an ethnic characteristic, or it's genetic, cultural, maybe, but in the U.S., it's a political designation, which is to say that the tribal governments are fully functioning governments. They're exercising what we call in law inherent power, which means it's the power they've always exercised as governments, that they exercised long before Europeans arrived. And I'll tell you, that's practically unique in the world. In other countries where tribes exercise governing power, it's because the national government has delegated that power to them. But here, tribes are separate sovereigns. And they're political sovereigns, which means that they get to figure out their own citizenship rules, as any country in the world does. And it may or may not involve proof of cultural identity or genetic identity or, this sort of thing. For one of the Civil War consequences on the politics side is that the 5 tribes were encouraged, and a number did, to adopt as citizens their former slaves. Some of whom had absolutely no native ancestry, and so there you had people who were citizens of tribes who weren't themselves native, and that wasn't a problem under U.S. law again, because as you say, it's a political classification.
Right, that's a problem that many tribes are now having to deal with. Now we've gotten, when I interrupted you, we were talking about listening to you speak about the, I guess, was it the post-Civil War period when these political activities were being laid out and plans were being made for the distribution of these, quote, unassigned lands, right?
Yeah, exactly. So to pick up there, so what happened was all of these Western lands then were made available to the U.S. for the resettlement. It's sort of the removal era part 2, for the resettlement of tribes from the southwestern states and from the northern plain states. And so a lot of those tribes, and most of the western Oklahoma tribes, were removed to, again, the Indian Territory during the decade or so after the Civil War, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, and others. And their sort of lands were demarcated and that sort of thing. But by the late 1870s, a railroad lobbyist in D.C. who happened to be Cherokee, a guy called Elias Boudinot, looked at a map and realized that there were still a lot of those lands that hadn't been used for the resettlement of tribes from other parts of the country. And he published an article in February 1879 in the Chicago newspaper in which he said, wait a minute, look, there are all these lands. Why are we giving them to tribes? Why don't we open them up for non-Indian settlement? And soon after this, the Boomer movement started, spearheaded by a guy named David Payne from Kansas, who could essentially look across the border and saw all of these lands that hadn't been assigned, so they called them the unassigned lands, and started agitating in Congress for Congress to pass a law opening them up to non-Indian settlement under the Homestead Act, and also illegally sending groups of settlers across the line to establish settlements. They routinely got kicked out by the U.S. Army. Payne himself was prosecuted and died in 1884 of a heart attack, but the cause was picked up in Washington, and it really took off in 1886 and 1887 when the Santa Fe Railroad ran that train line right down the middle of the Indian Territory that went through Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Moore, and Norman, where we are at OU. That just made it easier to access these lands, and the congressional agitation started really picking up speed, and they wrangled a representative from Illinois and persuaded him to add an amendment to the Indian Appropriations Bill in February 1889, authorizing the president, Benjamin Harrison, to proclaim the unassigned lands open for non-Indian settlement on a first-come, first-served basis. And that was February 1889, and it only took until April 22nd to get this set up. On that day at noon, they fired a gun and said, whoever wants it can have it.
And in the midst of this, we're hearing the term boomer there, and later on, somewhere along the line, sooner. Is that correct?
Well, sooner, yeah, the boomers are the folks who snuck across illegally and tried to force access. The Sooners are the ones who showed up on April 21st, most of them the day before, and snuck across the line into the unassigned lands and hid, picked the best lands. What you had to do when you got there, once you found your lands, was plant a stake, file a land title, and start making improvements to it, which could be digging a well or arranging, a foundation for a house or something like that. These guys figured if we get there a day early and nobody discovers us, then we've got to jump on the best lands. And because they got there a little sooner than they were supposed to, they were called Sooners. And ironically and somewhat perversely, we commemorate both of those groups of lawbreakers in our Boomer Sooner chant and team names.
Yeah, blasphemy as it might sound, that's true. And of course, I have rooted for that football team myself. But,
as have I.
But I'm not getting into the Boomer Sooner kind of thing. But it's an ironic twist of fate there. Now, as these settlers began to fill in these lands. I guess what was happening in the next. First of all, we've seen the paintings and I believe a photograph or two of these crowds as they charged across the line, and we're seeing guys on horseback and in wagons, and I think there's one I saw where a guy was on this big wheel bicycle and things like that. Is that kind of the collection of people that were on that border and made the rush?
Yeah, well, they came in from the north and from the south. A lot of them were on foot. Those were the ones easiest to photograph. The best estimates are there were about 50,000 people who made this land run from all over the world. People came from Europe. This was advertised in papers in major cities in Europe, and people came over, again, just the thought of free land in America, and it was pretty good land. Total amount of land was about 2 million acres. And the idea was to give away all of it if it could be given away. Some people took the train, which you could do. You just get on in the morning. I think by about 2:30 in the afternoon, the train had made it to Oklahoma City, and the cars emptied as people ran through the city to plant stakes. A little earlier than that, it had arrived at Norman, and Norman was settled, almost immediately as people jumped off to plant stakes in those town lots. People rode horses. Some people, if you couldn't afford a horse or a bicycle or the train, you'd walk. They came in by a huge variety of methods, and men and women. By the way, there were, this wasn't an all male thing. This was, people all over. Single women, widowed women were entitled to lands under the Homestead Act too, and often made the run or rode the train in.
Do you know of any Native people that took part in that event?
I can't imagine that there weren't, but it's a great question, and I do not know of any in particular. Mm-hmm. But perhaps among your listeners, there are some who will call in and say, "Yeah, my family did."
Yeah, interesting to run in this little thing and reclaim your own land. Essentially, is.
See, that would have been a really, if they could have pulled it off, if the Muskogee and Seminole nations had actually, packed the team of runners and had reclaimed all of their lands for free, the lands they had sold to the U.S.
Right now, let's talk geography here for a second. Now, those lands comprised major portion of the state of Oklahoma now. Can you give me like a percentage or some kind of measurement?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's pretty much from the South Canadian River at the bottom up to just north of Guthrie. It's a minority of the lands in the state. They were pressing up on the western side against the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation, which was enormous, and I believe itself as large as the unassigned lands. The initial run was maybe smaller than you might think, although again it was 2 million acres. If I knew the total number of acres in the state of Oklahoma, I could give you a percentage, but that should be pretty easy sort out. Having said that, 2 million acres is a lot of land.
Boy,
and of course it spread out. We haven't really talked about the Oklahoma Territory, but it was really the seedbed of the Oklahoma Territory and the platform on which virtually all of the tribes' ownership of the lands of Oklahoma was destroyed in fairly short order, because this was the first land run, that we talk about, but there would be subsequent land runs as allotment proceeded, and as the tribal reservations were broken up.
Now, go ahead.
And those followed, much the same pattern with much the same consequence, just a massive infusion of non-Indian population.
Now, the lands remaining in tribal control, was that what comprised what was known as Indian Territory?
Yeah, it was never formally called Indian Territory, but it was informally known as Indian Territory. And then eventually it would become formally a part of it, the Oklahoma Territory, the western part, while the eastern part of what becomes Oklahoma would still be informally the Indian Territory. It was the lands of the 5 tribes for the most part. And then it would all become the state of Oklahoma in 1907.
I think one of the references that keeps sticking in my mind was, are you familiar with the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales?
It's been a long time. I saw it in the theater when I was young.
Yeah, that Clint Eastwood flick, and with Chief Dan George, who was portraying a Cherokee man, and they made reference to going out and doing what they had to do for Eastwood's revenge, and his companion was there, and they made several references to Indian Territory and sort of being outside of the jurisdiction of law and order of the other white communities. Was that pretty much the case? Is that sort of fabricated?
Yeah, no, that's true, especially parts of it. But because the tribes exercised jurisdiction, sort of. At a certain point, the federal district court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, was given kind of police authority over the Indian Territory, and that's the true grit story, right? That somebody who escapes into the Indian Territory, and the goal is to haul them back to Fort Smith for prosecution by hanging Judge Smith. So it was because the jurisdictional issues were so complicated. It did mean for less likelihood that if you were a criminal, you'd get caught. And then the Panhandle in Oklahoma was of a different magnitude, because it wasn't clear who owned that. Because Texas claimed it as a county, and then eventually it became part of the lands that Oklahoma Territory would claim, but that didn't get resolved till much later. Hardly anybody lived there, but it was literally a no man's land, where nobody was really enforcing the law, and that was probably the most dangerous part of this whole territory.
Now, after this event, you have people who staked out their plots of land. By the way, how big were those claims?
Yeah, I think they were they were either 60 or 80 acres, and they were uniform parcels. Although you could try and get a hold of more than one if you wanted to.
Now, and after this group of settlers had begun building their communities, what essentially happened to those places? One of our banks has a series of commercials about how these communities grew from nothing, essentially. But I guess what was happening there was the railroad a major factor there. Was there farmers really beginning to produce crops for commercial purposes? What was going on?
Well, yeah. The railroad was really the key here, because the Santa Fe had established stations at the places that became the cities of the unassigned land. So Guthrie, Oklahoma City, what became Moore, and Norman were all stations on the Santa Fe Railroad, and the landrunners figured they were bound to become major settlement. So they were heavily infested by landrunners, and then became towns, basically because the railroad. So weren't technically built from nothing; they were built from railroad stations, and because they had access to the train. And the agricultural lands, and the goal really was to make it all agricultural, the area. Those sort of filled in too, but they were primarily to then serve the towns on the rail line. And farmers need to have access to markets, so this train could run crops down to Gainesville, Texas, and then farther into the Gulf Coast and get them shipped out. And so the agricultural areas nearer to the towns were more successful, faster, and the farther away you were from one of those railroad stations, I think the harder a go you had of it.
Now, as the communities began to develop, they were becoming more established, of course, and bringing in the kinds of things the community needs, whatever household goods, education, a more serious form of government and things like that. Was that evolution kind of a smooth one, or were there some problems, some clashes with tribes, perhaps, or someone else?
Well, yeah, not so much. The clashes with the tribes were certainly happening during this period, but it wasn't so much in those unassigned land settlements. It was more because at the same time, allotment was proceeding fairly aggressively, and so there was direct access to tribal lands for non-native peoples. And, when the Cheyenne, Arapaho lands were broken up, non-Indians flooded there, and there you'd see enormous conflict between the Indians and non-Indians, and the same thing was happening, in the Muskogee Nation when it got allotted and broken up, and this sort of thing. I think the unassigned lands were building sort of relatively peacefully, which may have made possible then the fairly relatively easy transformation they had from just being unassigned lands out in the middle of the Indian Territory to being a recognized federal territory of Oklahoma, which then enabled them to make the push for statehood. Just 20 years after the land run, less than 20 years, which is sort of astonishing.
Do you recall any of the names of some of these folks who were making these developments happening? I understand there were a lot of names like Kerr and others that were involved in the building of the state, but do you recall any of those kinds of folks?
Yeah, I don't. But what you'd find, I think, if you look particularly in central Oklahoma at the major political names from the early days, a lot of those would be families that had moved in from other states during the land run, either as land runners or after. More commonly after the land run, in order to take advantage of the fact that these new communities were here. Some of these would be builders. Some of them would be who made piles. When your contract is to build an entire city, imagine the amount of work and profit. People who lawyers, people interested in speculation, land and other speculation, and then of course before the end of the century, the oil people. Who came in once oil was discovered in the unassigned lands and in other parts of what by 1907 would become the state of Oklahoma.
Now, that's actually was on my mind there. Years ago, I believe I read some materials that were talking about how Oklahoma came to be, kind of, so to speak. And isn't this, or before this period, somewhere along the line there, wasn't there some sort of movement or initiative, perhaps, to bring Oklahoma, quote, Indian Territory into the Union as a state? Is that correct?
Yeah, and you may be thinking about the Sequoia statehood movement.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating story. The state, the territories that were called the Twin Territories by 1902, 1903, east of the eastern portion of the state was still where the Muskogee Nation is, and Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw, Choctaw was Indian territory, and then west of that was the territory of Oklahoma, which had started as just those 2 million acres in the unassigned lands, but by now had expanded to include everything in western Oklahoma. And a group of tribal leaders in 1905 decided to push Congress for the admission of the eastern portion of the Indian Territory as a state, to be named the state of Sequoia in honor of the great Cherokee syllabary creator, Sequoia. They held a constitutional convention. They drafted a constitution. They submitted it to Congress, and they got denied. And the reason they got denied was, by this time, there was a Republican president in the White House, Teddy Roosevelt, who was concerned that, because there was also thought given to Oklahoma Territory coming into the Union, who was concerned that both of these would be states dominated by the Democratic Party, and they would have an extra pair of electoral votes, which would make it harder for a Republican to win in the next presidential election. And that seems to be the principal reason for denying a separate Indian state. The following year, Oklahoma Territory said, well, let's come in, but we'll be the entire state. We'll sort of absorb the Indian Territory. That was fewer electoral votes, and the Roosevelt administration said, yeah, okay, we can live with that. Ironically, the people who had drafted the Sequoia Constitution then immediately moved to Guthrie, where they took over the drafting process for the Oklahoma Constitution. And these are names like, Alfalfa Bill Murray and others. And the Oklahoma Constitution mirrors largely the Sequoia Constitution that had been drafted for the separate Indian state. The merger of the two, then, and your listeners will know this image for sure, resulted in a ceremony once that the twin territories were joined and admitted as a state, as a single state by the United States. The ceremonial enactment of the marriage of the non-Indian man, the sort of your landrunner image, and the native woman who were going to come in theory to form this new state. Although I've often thought it was a wedding, but maybe a little bit of a shotgun wedding, and the gun was pointed at her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Osages are still dealing with that question. Now, let me sort of shift gears here toward our more modern age, if you want to call when I was in elementary back in the 50s, that's modern or not. The teaching of this particular section of Oklahoma history was extremely important at that time. There was a complete unit dedicated to the period, the land rush. And I remember as a child, taken out to the football field or something to take part in this, and we were holding a little towel, and when the signal came, we all rushed off into the field and threw our towel down and said, "This is, I claim this," and a lot of that was going on. I have to be honest and say I really didn't get much out of the lesson, but it was for me to get a chance to get outside and run around on the football field was just fine. Now, it was a different time and era, and certainly a different way of thinking. Now, has that changed much? I know you are a professor now. It's the history department. Is that correct?
I'm at the law school.
Law school. Thank you, sir. Now, is that still going on? I know that I've spoken to a state educator and said, well, it is part of our history and we have to teach it. So, okay. But from your observations, from your point of view of what you've been able to see, is that kind of thinking and activity still happening?
I ask my students about this, and so what I know is that or what I understand is that yes, it is still happening. The sort of celebration of the land run that you're talking about, the reenactment,
right?
But it's not happening today in as many places as it was happening when my kids went through school, and part of the program was reenacting or celebrating the land run. I agree with your teacher that it is important to teach it. I mean, it's the foundation of the modern state of Oklahoma. It's sort of the political origin of the modern state of Oklahoma, because land run leads to territory, which leads to statehood. But I think it's important to teach it in full context, and to be aware of, as we talked about briefly when we began talking, to understand where the land came from, that it originally belonged to somebody else, that there's a whole sort of Civil War background story to this behind the land run, and after the land run, there's a sort of dark story of political absorption, destruction or attempted destruction of tribal governments, destruction of the tribal land base, etc. So it's not really a pretty story, but it's an important story.
It's part of what makes the state what it is, I guess. Huh?
I think it is, and I think it's also important to understand it's sort of the origin of a lot of current tension between native and non-native populations in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I was going to go there, actually. When I mentioned this discussion we were having today among some of my colleagues, they were going, oh, boy, here we go. And weren't particularly delighted to be reminded of that particular era. But they seem to, all say, well, that was then and this is now. So have you really detected any of that in your experience?
Detected,
as you say, kind of a residual resentment, so to speak.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I'll tell you what, I'll share what sort of I think is maybe behind it. I think there's understandable and justifiable Native resentment in Oklahoma of the fact that this land was all ours at one point, and now it's not. And this is sort of a microcosm of what happens all over the continent, right? These people came in and they took our land, and it was unfair in sort of a grand sense, like a massive injustice. What the land run does for Oklahoma, I think, is it provides one precise moment in time where you can visualize this multi-generational process at work. Because what really happened is it's sort of a slow incursion of non-native peoples. Maybe for a while through marriage to tribal citizens, and then they'd acquire land, and then the allotment era. That's more abrupt, but it's still sort of a slow purchase of land, incursion, and this sort of stuff. Land run, it's noon, April 22nd, a gun's fired, and there they come. All of the non-Indians running in to take lands that were ours. And it's the strongest image I know in all of North American history of that dispossession, that moment of dispossession. And I think for that reason it's sort of especially focused attention. And I do think it's an image that lives in most Oklahomans, either as sort of a heroic moment, if your ancestors participated, because it was bold coming out here to unknown lands and running, or if you're a native citizen, I think it has to live inside you as sort of as a really unhappy, sad, traumatizing moment.
Yeah. Well, Professor Lindsay Robertson of the Oklahoma University Law Department, we want to thank you so much this morning for chatting with me and kind of perhaps bursting a balloon or two, but giving our listeners a chance to know more about this critical part of Oklahoma's development. I want to thank you, sir. We appreciate your time, and we'll get out of your way now. I know you're a busy man, but chances are we may want to chat with you again at some point.
Well, I'd be more than happy to. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, now we're going to take a short pause and we'll be back with Nelson Harjo the third with the election board to kind of update us on some of the activities that'll be here pretty quick, including a candidates fair. So please stay with us here on Muskogee Radio on 1240 The Brew.
Who am I? Am I Indian? Just 'cause I'm a girl from the res, don't make things up about me. What if I move away? Then who am I? Some kids try meth just to escape. But then I think about my grandma, my little brother, my beadwork, my poetry, and I think, I like who I am, and I know meth is not for me.
Check out ncai.org, a message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
Who am I? Am I Native? I don't want people assuming things because I'm Indian. I just want to be me. But how do I live in two worlds? Some guys just check out by doing meth. But that ain't for me. Because I see my family, my friends, my drum making, my future. There are a lot of cool things about being who I am, and meth isn't one of them.
Learn more at ncai.org, a message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
All right, we have just passed the one of the major highlights of the Muskogee Creek year with the annual festival, and now we're coming up to another major event that affects our people, and that's our elections. Who is going to lead the Muskogee Creek Nation? Now, we have Nelson Harjo III joining us here from the election board. Now, you're the manager, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, we are looking at some events coming up fairly soon that kind of lead into this year's election. One is the candidate fair, and of course the deadline for candidates to file and become part of the process. So first of all, I guess let's tackle that first one. The fair is coming up in early July, is that right?
Yes, July 12th in the Mound Building in the council chambers, 11 to 1 o'clock. We're having a candidate fair for anybody that's interested in running for one of the council seats that's coming up. We encourage everybody to come to that. We're going to be sharing information that, pertains to, the filing process, the do's and don'ts of campaigning and things of that nature.
Okay, so it's for people who are considering running for office.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and it's not election pitches yet, right?
No, matter of fact, the candidate fair has nothing to do with the actual campaigning process itself for the prospective candidates. This is just an information, a forum. We're going to have a presentation about the qualifications. What does it take to run for national council? What are the filing fees? Just basic information that each candidate should be aware of.
Have there been any changes in those requirements in the last year or two?
No, there hasn't been any changes to my knowledge. There have been some amendments, the past 10 years, prior to that, but these last, there's nothing changed from the last election to this election as far as the qualifications to run for candidacy.
Well, let's take a second and run over that list for people who are interested or want to make sure that they know what they're talking about and this kind of thing. So what are those qualifications?
Okay, so for the National Council, this is what's coming up. The seat Bs, first of all, you do have to be a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. You have to be at least 18 years of age. You have to be 1/4 or more degree of Creek blood on your citizenship card, and that's verified through the citizenship office. You must reside within the district that you're running for one full calendar year. You have to be a tribally registered voter for at least 6 months prior to the date of filing, and you can't have any felonies within the past 10 years in order to run for council.
All right. Now, this is a fairly simple list. It seemed like people could deal with it, and if they want to become a candidate, there's a fee attached to becoming a candidate.
Yes, sir. There's a filing fee of $500.
Right, so you better be darn serious and no facetious kind of candidacy.
Yes.
Now, some of those things you mentioned are coming up in questions people are raising. Obviously the blood quantum has always kind of been with us, and residencies and other things. Now, what are some of the issues maybe that might be of some contention there?
Well, I do recognize the fact that there has been talks about the blood quantum issue. Fortunately for our office, as far as the politics that go behind those questions and concerns really doesn't affect us, because all we do is make sure that everybody gets a fair shake when it comes to the election process, when it comes to filing and things of that nature.
So those kind of changes and things would have to go through the council and be signed off by the principal chief?
Most definitely. I believe, going through the council would be a good starting off point for any of those amendments to take place. They are the legislative body of the Muskogee Creek Nation. A lot of people, have the tendency to think that, we are the final say-so when it comes to, the election process and everything. Really, we're just, the good shepherds of the election process. We just oversee everybody from point A to point B, through the election, and answer any questions that they might have and just try to help guide them, while they're, running for office.
Are you hearing any feedback from citizens about what they might want to see happen, whether it is a change in blood quantum or something else? Are they speaking up?
Me personally, I haven't heard anything. I've been so busy with trying to keep everything on track. I kind of push all of those other things aside. But if it's good, positive feedback, if it's things that that really catch your ear, that maybe this could be something that we can look at implementing later on in the future. Of course, those things we would present to the council, say, hey, this is a really good idea. We might want to do this. But right now, I really haven't heard anything one way or the other. I believe after July 12th, after we have our candidate fair, we're going to start to see a lot more people start to come out of the woodworks about the election, because at that point, we'll be pretty far into the process, and candidate filings just that next week. So,
what actions has your office taken to kind of do some sort of voter registration drive, kind of to get a table out there and say sign up to vote? You got to do this and that.
Oh,
have you actually had the chance now to do a few things?
Oh yeah, we've done quite a few actually since I've been over here at the election board. We just recently were at the festival on Saturday. I think we were there from 10 to 2. We set up at the ceremonial dance from 6 to 9. And we also had a registrar training event 2 weeks ago on the 14th. The goal of having a registrar is not only is it specifically stated in the election codes that we are supposed to have one registrar for every 1,500 registered voters of the tribe. We're supposed to keep that. It's supposed to be an ongoing thing. The purpose of a registrar is to help in our endeavor to register more people, to update more people's files, registration files, whether they need a change of name, address, if they want to switch from precinct to absentee or vice versa. So we're hoping, taking those actions is going to help broaden our base, as far as setting up at different events, not only here in our own Creek country, but, anywhere. So we're always looking for people to sign up. Give me a call, email us,
Right. The next edition of Muskogee Nation News, July 1st, has quite an extensive list of voters, I presume. And believe me, I got a little bleary-eyed trying to proofread that list. Just as long as my name wasn't on there, I thought we're okay. But what are you doing with that? What information do you need from people who are on that list?
There is certainly a breakdown for the sake of spacing with the paper itself. we didn't want to burden the paper with having to devote solely like 2 to 3 pages of just nothing but names. Basically, whenever we submitted that list to the newspaper, it's a whole host of different issues that are coming up with the names on that list. One could be the majority of the time it's that person has moved and has not updated their information with the office. I know we started getting immediate feedback through social media whenever that was published that, hey, my name is, on this list, but I already received, a request for absentee ballot, in the mail. And that's probably true, but the post office keeps a list of forwarding addresses for, so many months. So if that person has moved and the post office has that person's forwarding address on file, naturally they're going to get that piece of mail that's forwarded to their new address. But after such a period of time, like next year or 2 years from now, that might not always be the case. So we're asking everybody that was on that list, for some reason or another, the address we have on file is not matching up with the address that maybe the post office has on file for you now. So please contact us. Let us know what's going on. We want to get you updated. We want to make sure that you're receiving all the information that you need to be receiving.
The list everything, that's, wonderful idea. And of course, our paper is glad to do it as a service to our citizens. But what would be the consequences of someone who is on that list but hasn't done anything to correct the problem? And they show up at the polls, would they not be allowed to vote?
No, that consequence would not happen if one of the people on that list were to show up at a poll. Of course, we want everybody to update their information as often as needed. But the goal to publish that list of names was to really catch all of the absentee voters. A lot of correspondence with the absentee voters happens through the mail service. So if we were to send an absentee ballot out to a person with a bad address, there's no guarantee that that ballot would get to that person if their address is not, up to date in our system, because that's what we go off of. Our database system contains all of the addresses for people that come and register. So if that's not up to date, we can't guarantee that ballot's going to get to you. Now, it doesn't affect the precinct voters in the way it does the absentee voters, because if somebody elects to go to a polling site, precinct site to vote, as long as we show in our records that they are a registered voter, we will not deny them that right.
Okay, that would be nice to not make anybody a little upset. The process now is underway. Last time you were here, we talked about some different ideas that were percolating there. One was going to an all mail-in ballot. He cited some success with the Choctaws and things like that. Now, has there been any reaction at all that you're aware of from listeners after hearing something like and seeing it on the paper?
I know that that the question how to improve voter participation has been there for quite some time. I don't think there's one catch-all solution to really improve the overall participation, but I do think that there are a number of different options to explore. All mail voting is one of those, voting by mail. Another one would be to implement early in-person voting to increase more actual voting opportunities, for people that may not be able to go, that certain Saturday and vote. That's something right now that's very popular across the nation, especially with the younger voting age demographic. The more easy you make it for them to walk in and cast a ballot, the more likelihood that they are to actually come and vote. So if they have like 2 or 3 different options when they can show up to vote, it's really starting to catch their attention, because with the atmosphere of today's, technology instant, if people can't do something right then and there, more than likely they're not going to do it. So if we increase that window, for them to be able to come in when they need to, or when they can, and cast a ballot, the more likelihood that they will do so.
Now, this is part of your campaign to update your mailing list and kind of eliminate those names that should not be on there. Have you any feel for how much you might have discovered so far? Like people who've passed on, that were still on the list, or things like that.
Oh yeah. I don't know if we touched upon this last time I was on the air, but we did go through. We did scrutinize our records 2 months ago. Matter of fact, in April, we presented a file to Citizenship's office and said, okay, out of these lists of registered voters we have in our files, can you tell us, who needs to be on there, who is a citizen, who's not a citizen, who is still alive, who is not? And they kicked back roughly 700 names to us that were either no longer a part of the tribe for whatever reason, or they had passed away. So we removed close to 700 people, from our files that didn't need to be on there. Because they were no longer, for one reason or another, eligible to vote in our elections.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good to hear, because you always hear horror stories of people who have been deceased for some time who are still being voted, and others who are passing around these ballots to those who really don't qualify as voters, and trying to do things like that, ballot stuffing and that sort of thing. Now, the next event is the candidate fair, right? And again, the dates and location.
We actually have a citizens gathering happening in California this Saturday, July 1st. I didn't bring the time, but it's at the Native American Methodist Church there in Anaheim, California. We will be, this is not something that we did ourselves. This is something that I believe the citizens out there request tribal leadership to come out, and so they extended that offer to some other programs and entities of the tribe to go out there as well. So we'll be out there this Saturday to set up registration, update anybody's information, should that, be necessary. So technically, I guess that would be our next big function that we're planning on. And then we have the candidate fair, July 12th. That would be probably one of the big highlights.
Okay, and I guess the time really doesn't make that much difference to us here. It's if you're in California listening, it's 3 hours later than what it is now. You got to get up at 5 in the morning to go vote. Go for it. All right. Well, Nelson, I'm sure we're going to be chatting with you more about the election as it gets nearer. We've undertaken upon ourselves to divide a number of issues that we will be examining, and I'm sure we're going to kind of put you on the spot here and there, but feel free. Please remember that we're trying to do it for the benefit of all of our citizens. So we want to say Mado to you. Thank you so much for making time and coming in today. We appreciate your helping us out here on the program.
All right. Well, Mado for having me.
Okay, and go. All right. Well, we've only got a few announcements here, so let's just pop through them real quick, and I'm sure we will. Okay, what do we got here? First of all, if any of you saw the new Muskogee Media T-shirts, those are on sale. You need to get a hold of Chelsea at our office. Cash only is 732-7720. That's the Miko and it's the Johnny and their mugs, too. Seminyata Hockey Cultural Expression Day Camps. One's coming up 17th and 21st in Glenpool. You want to get a hold of the Youth Services people, 549-2557. Geez, I think that's about all we can get in here this morning, so appreciate you all checking with us. We will have a show next week. We'll be talking to nationally acclaimed journalist, native journalist Mark Trahant about what's happening on the national scene with the president and the budget and the BIA and everything else. So check us out next week. Mado Maba Hedges good. You've been listening to Muskogee Radio. Join us again next week for more local, tribal, and community news and updates. But